Hello and welcome to the video. This is a video that's prompted by this gentleman here. This was a question from a gentleman called WR Stu. So Stu, this is for you. Now I have a lot of videos, hundreds and hundreds of videos on OpenTX, and everything that you can do on OpenTX you can do on EdgeTX. But Stu was asking for, well, is there a way that we can kind of get an overview of what all the menu bits are on the radio, because it is incredibly confusing. And you know what? It absolutely is. When you're new to one of these modern radios running something like EdgeTX, then it can be a little bit overwhelming. These are incredibly powerful radios. OpenTX and EdgeTX are incredibly powerful operating systems. So I'm going to create this little series. This is the first one. I'll put a link down below and I'll answer all of your questions about EdgeTX based stuff. OpenTX, again, I'll put links down below, loads of stuff already kicking about for OpenTX, but I thought it would be fun to kind of come back and revisit some of this stuff for new pilots on the latest radios with EdgeTX, which is kind of the latest version of the OpenTX system. So let's power the radio on first, and let's talk about the different pieces that are in EdgeTX. Now again, EdgeTX and OpenTX are fundamentally the same thing. The code is very different these days, but they actually do the same stuff. So everything I'm about to show you in here is similar for OpenTX as well. Now on a radio like this, there are several different menus that you can access. Let's start with the system menu. Pressing and holding the system button will take you into the system menu, and the way you navigate around is using these buttons on the left hand side, which usually have page button. If it only has one page, this has two for page forward and backwards. And also with EdgeTX, it also has a touch screen as well, so you can go directly to the screen. If you only have one page button, long pressing and holding the page will actually take you in the opposite direction. But let's very, very quickly go through this menu. The first one you come into is Tools. These are all the Lua scripts that you can run and access on the radio. Lua scripts is something that is incredibly powerful. It's essentially a programming language, and Lua scripts can be anything that puts stuff on your regular screen. If I just return out of this, I could put a Lua script on here that showed me the telemetry from the model. There are scripts available for ArduPilot, for iNav, for Betaflight, and lots of other things. But if I just press and hold the system menu again, this is a list of all the different Luas that are on the SD card. And some of them we can actually run here directly. So this is a spectrum analyzer. So here we can see all of the different noises that it can hear. We've got lots of bits flying around because this is in my place where I film. There's obviously Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and everything else. Here we're going to press return out of that to come out of it. So this is the tools area. This is where you're going to come if you want to configure your Crossfire or your ELRS radios and receivers, but also come and do things with your multi-protocol 4-in-1 module. This is where you will find it. Paging across, we have the contents of the SD card that's plugged into the radio. So if you plug the SD card into your computer, this is the same kind of layout that you've got. So surprise, surprise, all the images are held in the images. Let me just return back from that. Whoops. So you need to select the... I'm touching a touch sensitive screen. Let me just come out of that. To go back up, you just press the one above it. There we go. So I'm going to use the buttons to navigate on this, but remember you do also have touch, as I've just shown, but we can select the one we're interested in. So in here, here's all the model memories, right? So we can go back up, and then we have all of the things like the sounds information. Here's all the English stuff. Here's all the sounds that the radios can play that you can assign to things. Next one in here that looks like a cog is the main setup for the radio. So this is kind of the basic radio setup that doesn't have anything to do with models as such. So the date and time, the battery range, whether or not it makes sounds, whether or not it buzzes for certain things, gives you warnings about the low battery, whether or not where you are, what the units are, all that stuff is in here. So when you get a new radio, this is a great place to come, if for no other reason than to just set your date and time. Next one then is themes. This is how the screen looks. This is the EdgeTX default, these kind of all these different blues, but you can actually, you know, create your own and you can have different versions of stuff. I would keep it on default when you're first starting out, but you can customize the radio to look exactly the way you want. Next one is something called global functions. Now this is something we're going to see other parts of in the actual model memories themselves, but global functions allow you to set up things that happen all the time for particular switches. So you could potentially have the trainer switch set for one particular switch, and that's set at radio level, so that's set for everything there on after. But what we'll do is we'll carry on. Next one is the trainer. This is where we set up the trainer function. Obviously, you have the ability to have a master and slave relationship, and this is where you do all that and you connect all that stuff together, how it all works. Really, really handy, including calibrate, because the center channel of the student radio might be slightly different. Again, see the trainer videos for OpenTX on how all that works. It is exactly the same. Page again, we have the hardware. So this is where on the radio is told what all the different switches and pots and sliders and things are. It's all set up here. So if you changed a switch, physically took the back off the radio and desoldered maybe a 3-position switch for a momentary switch, in here is where you would tell it all that works. The other really important thing on this is at the very top, we have the calibration as well. Calibration is really important, and if you find that the middle stick positions on your gimbals are not exactly 1500 and things like that, this is where you come in. Or if, for example, I've had issues recently, a couple of people have been in touch where the 6-position switch doesn't give you a full 6 positions, come in and rerun calibration and just follow the on-screen prompts. Last one in the system menu tells you all about what you're actually running on the radio. So the version of the firmware, the date and time of the stamp, and what options and things. And you can also go into modules RX version and it will tell you what you've actually got everything set as. So that is the system menu. So that is one that you don't tend to go in an awful lot. It's something that you go in when you set it up or you change something, or you might want to run a stick calibration. Most of the time I'll go into the system menu on a day-to-day basis just to run one of those Lua scripts to configure the radio that's in the back, or the 4-in-1 that's actually part of the radio, maybe to set something up or to configure the receiver or whatever. The other big menu that you're going to come across that you'll spend most of the time in is the model memory. So every model on the radio has all of this information behind it. So you have all of these across the top. Now this looks incredibly complicated, but actually for basic models, you're going to use a very small amount of it. The first one is called the model setup, and guess what? That is where you give it things like a name. You can actually give it a model image. So, you know, if we wanted to give it a name, let me give it one called Lee. We can actually give it a model image, but there aren't any on the SD card that's here, so guess what? We're not going to do that. And then we can set up things like the timers, and then we can also set up things like the pre-flight checklist, so we can get the radio to actually show reminders when it starts up, and how everything is all set up. This is where you tell your multi-protocol module, which most of these EdgeTX radios are going to have, what kind of protocol you want to run. So here's all the different options, lots and lots of different options in here, and then to actually go and do things like the binding. So this is where you do all the basic setup for the model. Paging through, the next one is called Heli setup. You may or may not have this on your radio, depending if you selected it as an option when the firmware went on. This is where it allows you to set up something called swash mixing, which is a helicopter-based thing. I have an entire video on it. I'll put a link down below. But if you're not into helicopters, or you're running a helicopter with a 5-barless controller, you're not going to need this screen. Next one is something called flight modes. Flight modes, an awful lot of pilots don't go anywhere near and don't use, but they are incredibly powerful. Say, for example, that you had a glider and you had a setting for launch, you had a setting for normal flight, you had a setting for crow, you had a setting for reflex. Then what you could do is that you set up the flight modes, And then by flicking one switch, you could have the flight mode then turn lots of other things on and off. And what that means is, rather than have to set up one switch that then is referenced in 15, 16 other places in the radio to change everything that you need to change, you just change the flight mode, and it's the flight mode that then does everything. And that means then if you subsequently want to change the switch or change the way things happen, it works great. Also allows you to do things like fading in and out. So if you have a situation where you want to deploy flaps as part of it, you can have all that timed. Again, when you're starting out, don't worry about flight modes. Flight modes is something that you'll find you'll discover you have a need for as you get into more complex setups. Now we're into the meat. This is, apart from the first one, the model setup, the inputs page is one that you're going to come across. In the model setup, this is where you actually define how the controls are going to be read and used by the radio. Now, this is a little bit confusing because the next one we're going to have a look at is called mixes, and that decides how the controls are then presented and sent to the receiver. So why do you need two? We've got one for inputs and then one for mixes, for how those controls are mixed. Why can't we do it in one place? Well, you can actually do slightly different things. If I edit this, we can see here that we can do things like adding expo. We can actually assign it so it only happens on different flight modes. We can do all kinds of funky stuff. So if you only want maybe the throttle to work from the 50% position upwards, then you can set it in the inputs and then use that input in the mixes. So rather than have to use the same control in the same way with the same amount of expo or whatever, you can set up that physical control numerous times within inputs, and then it's available to use in other parts of the model setup. By default, in a simple setup, it'll look something like this, and it'll look exactly the same. If we page across, you kind of almost can't tell that I've moved. The big difference with this is that it's actually mixing to channels. So these are the channels that your receiver is going to be putting out, or if you're having a PWM receiver, this is where these channels are presented. The default order for lots of radios and things these days is AETR. If you're a Spectrum pilot, you'll expect it to be TAER, and you can change that in the setup for the radio. But you can move these around. So if you wanted to, you could kind of select them. Let's click on it and we can say move, and we can put it on channel 5. We'll paste it in there. So there, well, we've moved aileron. Let's move that back actually, because move, put it on channel 1, paste. So you can move these things around. We can have multiple ailerons. So if we press and hold enter and say edit, we can now say that we can give it a name. Let's for speed, let's not do that. But again, we can just come out of this, and there we go. We have another aileron. So now we have two ailerons. Say it was on a wing. We could plug one into one side, one into the other. So inputs and mixes are two screens that you'll spend a bit of time with when you're setting everything up. The next one then is outputs. Now this, again, it seems really confusing. We seem to have three things that's doing what some radios like Spectrum and others will do in almost one step. So again, inputs is going to tell the radio how to use the physical control inside the radio, and then you can assign that into your mixes, because it might be in a wing, for example, you have one channel that's doing two things. If we copy and pop that, paste. There, it might be that you have a channel that has elevator. Let's go down to 50%. That looks like that. And it might have an aileron that looks like that. That's how a wing would be set up. So channel 2 is now set for an elevon on something like a flying wing. Then we have the outputs. Now these are where I would recommend you do things like reverse. So if we look at channel 1 and we hit and say edit, we can see here that we have the ability to set a sub trim. We have a min and max position. So say, for example, it might be, I don't know, a gear door or something that you don't want to open past a certain amount, or a tilting servo that is physically limited to a certain value. You can set them in here so it doesn't physically damage the model. We can decide whether we want it reversed or inverted or not. We can add a curve. We'll come on to curves in a minute. Set the center and how the subtrim actually affects the channel. Now, in reality, what do you actually use all this stuff for? Well, I only ever use this screen for two things. First of all is to reverse the channel itself. So let's do that again. So I would, potentially reverse it, and you can see it's reversed because it actually says inverted now underneath. And also I come in here when you have flown the model and you have moved all your trims. So at the moment you see all the middle channel values of 1500. We just return out of this. You see all the trims on the screen. Let's pretend we're flying a fixed one without a flight controller. And to fly it properly, I need to have all the controls in that position. When you finish flying, what you do is you go into the model menu, you flash across until you get to here. You go right to the bottom or scroll all the way around. And you say add all trims to sub trims. You press and hold enter. And look what happened now. All of those values from those trimmed positions from the controls have now been put in here nice and safe. And if I come out of here, all the trims are back in the neutral position. If you're a fixed wing pilot, this is incredibly useful because it means so long as all your trims are in the middle position, then you're set and ready to go. You might need the odd click of, I don't know, elevator trim maybe if your center of gravity is fractionally out, but that's one of the cool things that you can do. And to be honest, that's pretty much all I do with it. Okay, so model page again, where were we up to? We've done outputs, so that's how the output screen work. Curves. Now curves are incredibly powerful. All I'm going to do for this introductory video is let you know that these exist and you can create curves. You can actually decide how you want them all to work and where you want to move them. Now why would you be interested in a curve? Well, most of the relationships, things like an aileron, elevator, throttle, rudder, have a linear relationship between the position of the stick and the channel value that the receiver outputs. However, you may want to change that, and there's many reasons why you would. Again, when you're first starting out, you're probably not going to do anything with curves, and that's absolutely fine. Just know that it's here, and it's something that you can play with if you want to kind of change things around. It's really fun and one of the super duper powerful things to be able to set curves. If you're a heli pilot, you'll know what these are. If you're not a heli pilot, you may never have to come in and have a play with them. However, a lot of the advanced things that I do in Edge and OpenTX ends up using curves as part of that. Next thing then are something called global variables. Now, global variables, again, just be aware that they are here. They are things that you can set that can be modified and used in other places. So one of the things that you may have noticed, if I come down in something like mixes, let's look at the first channel again and edit that. You'll notice that these things on the right hand side, you have these ability called GVs. Now we can set things like the weight and the offset. We can even set things like the amount of expo that we want just by dialing it in here as a hard value. However, by selecting a global variable, we can have that global variable changed inside the radio, and that dynamically changes it. So it could be that certain things happen automatically and the global variable is then set. Again, if you are not into advanced setups on the radio, you're probably going to never go anywhere near a global variable, and that's absolutely fine. But be aware that they're there and they're available for more advanced setups. Last one then is logical switches that we'll get into some kind of detail with. Logical switches are kind of software switches that work in the same way as a physical switch does on the radio. But logical switches are turned on and off by things inside the radio, and then you can use them as though it were a physical switch. So say, for example, that you have lights that you can turn on and off on the plane. It could be that you assign a switch to be able to turn them on and off. However, you could set up a logical switch that would maybe use a value from the telemetry that's coming back from the model, so that when the battery voltage goes below a particular value, it then turns on a logical switch. And then that logical switch can be used in place of the physical switch you were using to turn the lights on as a nice visual indicator that it's time to land. Logical switches, again, are incredibly powerful things and allow you to turn things on and off and change the way that things work in lots of other parts of the radio. But again, for basic setups, you're probably not going to come across them. Special functions. Now, special functions are something that you may use even in basic setups, because you can set it up to a switch. We'll set it up to SE for this. And let's return out of that. And lots of functions. We can have it turning on the trainer. We can have something called instant trim. Instant trim is fantastic on a plane. Rather than you have to use all those little switches, you can just flick this on once, and then it'll save all those trim positions in one move. Fantastic for maidening a plane. There's also, let me go back into there, things like adjustments, volumes, setting the failsafe. But the ones that I tend to use it for are play sound and play track, because you can have it so that when you have a particular switch, maybe this is the switch that you use to drop the landing gear on a particular model, then great. What you could do is then you can set up play track so that it actually plays an audio file that says gear down or something, so that as you do it, the radio will let you know which switch you have flicked. And that's a great way when you're looking at the model rather than looking at the radio for it to tell you what's going on. Last one then in this is the telemetry screen. The telemetry screen is probably not something you're going to get too involved in. The only time I really come in here is when I have to discover sensors. Maybe it's a new model with telemetry set up and I want all that telemetry to be on the radio and those sensors to be available, so I could put a Lua script on the main screen and have all of that information presented to me. This is where I would come in for it. So hopefully, Stu, that helps a little bit. There is a lot of information around for Edge and OpenTX. That is a whistle-stop tour. There's only one other control that I'll show you how to navigate for, because it's not obvious looking at this. How do I change models? If you press and hold the Enter key, you get another model setup sub-menu that allows you to select, do a channel monitor, model or settings. So here, if we go into select model, then there's the two models that are currently set up. There's the one we're currently playing with. If we want to select another one, then we can press and hold the Enter key. We say select model. And then there we are, we're into the other one. So that is the only other control that you use on a regular basis, pressing and holding the set key. So in summary, there are only a very small subset of screens that you will probably use when you're starting out. The first one is in the system menu, just going into the radio setup, making sure the date and time are right and things like the volume and stuff is set how you want it. And then also in the model setup, I would recommend coming and playing with the first screen, which is model setup, which is the timers, how the radio is working, things like adding an image, all that kind of goodness. And then the other ones are your inputs, your outputs, and your mixes. Those are the three that it's worthwhile coming into. Inputs to define how the controls are used, mixes to mix those together if you need to, and then outputs to determine how those limits and things are used on the model. And then the only other one that I would use is our friend special functions, and that's to add things like voice cues. Everything else is then things that you can learn and get to as you get more familiar with the radio and you want to get more advanced.
Thank you for spending your time today watching that video. You can find me in all the usual places on social media, and if you're trying to learn about a subject, then check out the playlist. All of my videos are organized into easy to follow playlists that, if you're trying to learn a topic, will take you from the basics right the way through to some pretty advanced stuff.